자, 여러분 안녕하세요. 잘 지내셨죠? 네. Let's get back to our class. So this is week 5. So as usual, that we have 3 sessions. So the first session is about story. So last class we're talking about the translators. So we put the story on the history context. In another word, we are looking around how was the translators in the Greece, and I started with the Greek. And with the Greek, do you remember the Greek people? They thought the Greek language is the common language, so they don't have to learn any foreign language. So when it comes, they wanted to keep their language as pure as possible. In another word, they recognize the value of linguistic purity. They didn't want the foreign language to affect the linguistic element of the Greek language. Then after we are done with the Greek, they moved to the Latin. So maybe the Latin has remained dominant language for more than 1,000 years. And it's interesting to notice that there are 3 reasons for the Latin language to keep its linguistic dominance for more than 1,000 years in Europe. The first was the military power of Roman, and second was the rise of Roman law, and third was, what was it? That was the church power. Actually, the Latin language is still the official language of the Vatican community. Then finally the English began to rise as a common language. So, in the second session, we are talking about the text reliability. So, what is reliability? Reliability is something about it's the choice between the effect and the accuracy. So, we talked about it's always the choice of the translator to make their translation to be accurate or to be effective. So we introduced the scale of Harvey. Harvey put the types of reliability on the scale. Yeah. So Harvey, there are several types of text reliability. So if that is the most faithful to the source text, source language text, that the Harvey said that was literal translation. In another word, if the translator decides to be effective on the target language audience, that is fluent, or it is free. So translator must decide to be, I would say this is the fidelity end of the scale. And this is, I would say, fluency end of the scale. So, how can we decide on these several types of textual reliability? So we talked about it all depends on the client demand, or it depends on the scopus. Scopus means the purpose of translation. So today also we are going to talk about Naida. So Naida is a very faithful Christian. Actually, he was faithful Calvinist. So he was talking about the 2 types of equivalence. The first is formal equivalence, and the other is dynamic equivalence. So today, we are going to talk about Naida's 2 types of equivalence. First is formal, and the other is dynamic equivalence. So we are going to explain from the Bible, then how different it is, and how can we choose to choose our translation to be formal or dynamic equivalence. And also, we are done with the session 2. We are moving to session 3. Session 3, I'd like to remind you, the first step of our practice is read and recall. So I would say this is AA or BP translation. I'd like to make AA means A is your mother tongue language. B is your foreign language. So most of us are Koreans, so if you say AB translation, it means it's a translation from Korean language to English. Or if you say BA translation, that means translation between English and Korean. So we'll be also talking about later. So if you are Koreans, it will be AB or BA translation. So if we were the Korean, which demand is stronger between the AB translation or BA translation? In other words, is it easier for Koreans to translate from Korean language to English or the vice versa? So this will be the topic. So you may have the question on this issue. It is about directionality. It's a matter of directionality. This is one of the major topics the translators say, so which demand is stronger, AB or BA? And for the native speakers, which is more efficient to the AB or BA translation? So we are getting back to session 1. Then we are going to continue with the historic story about the translator. So today's topic is translator in Latin America. So we have some Spanish student, so he might be interested to know what is the history of translation in Latin America. So the subtitle is The Conquest. So the conquest, as in the Spanish conquerors, they began to take control of the native Indian countries. And also we are moving until USA, America. So we are going to spend about 10 minutes about the stories about the translation in America and Latin America. Then you can find some clue to answer to this question, AB or BA translation, which is more efficient for translator to take up. So just one highlight of this one is it's interesting to notice the difference between the USA, North America, and Latin America when it comes to history of translators. For example, in the North America, in the United States, the first generation of translators were Puritan ministers. They need the translation as a way of evangelism, 전도. So they happen to learn the native Indian language, and also they can speak English, so they could serve as a translator between the early colonists, and native Indian. And also, it would be interesting to notice who is the first generation of translators in Latin America. Then you will find interesting contrast between the North America and Latin America. So we'll get back on this story after we are doing something else. So this is the outline of our class. And before we are doing this, I think that it's better for us to know the flow of our class, where we are going, so what we have done, and where we are moving to. So let me remind you that first of all, we started with the question of the contemporary world is so globalization. So the world has never been reduced to such a small place. Everybody in the world can communicate simultaneously. This is an amazing world that we have never, the former generation has never dreamed of. However, there is an opposite trend. Despite the globalization trend, the language remains still multilingual. The linguistics say there are about 3,000 languages, and maybe they predict that half of them will be dead in the next few decades. Anyway, this is an interesting contrast in contemporary world. So we started a question here. So, do we need more bilinguals? Or do we need more translators or interpreters? So after posing these two topics, then we are moving our topics on the two trails. On the one trail, we are talking about the bilinguals. On the other trail, we are talking about translators. So on the bilingual trail, so we started with the question of why English? So do you remember? The first thing that we can answer to this question is Brush, American linguist. He was talking about three circles. So his three circles gives an insight why English should be a common language in the world, and it is well positioned to continue to be so. Then, why English then? Then today we are moving on this bilingual trail. So we are talking about the power or number. So today we are going to talk about why English. Is it because of the number of English speakers? Or is it because of the power of English speakers? So we are putting it on the history context. So we are in the next module that we are going to spend about 20 minutes about this one. And also the next class, we will continue, the class we will also doing about, we are sharing the story about the people. So there is a people. There is a group of people who contributed to the rise of English as a common language. So I already netted the text. So there was someone is a keeper of English and fixer of English and former of English. And also there is another person who enriched English, and also another person who popularized English. So we are spending about 15 minutes about the people, people contributors. Then after we are done, then we are using this text for the session 3. Session 3, so we are going to practice consecutive interpretation. That's for you to do. So this is the first time for our class for you to challenge the consecutive interpretation. So I expect, I believe you have already read this text. Then I'm going to spend another lecture. Then I will give you 10 minutes for pair practice. You are going to practice consecutive interpretation with your partner. Then we will invite 3 pairs to come over here and make the consecutive translation, interpretation. So, then next class, we will do about the lexical stuff. So week 5, we are doing the lexical stuff. This is about vocabulary. As you know, the English, so English is not pure. The language is democratic. So language should be something dynamic, and language is something like a fashion. It changes. And one of the English is a prime example that shows the language is open-minded. In other words, English was an importer of a foreign language, while English was exporter of its own language to global society. So this is something very democratic and dynamic process that made English unique in the linguistic history. So in the next week, we will do lexical stuff. And also, after we are done, we are asking another question. Then, why not Chinese? China is emerging as a global power, so it's nowadays in Korea, more and more students, they are interested in Chinese language. So, why not Chinese? Oh, maybe Chinese. Do you think the Chinese language may replace English as the future global language? Do you think so? So we are going to discuss. So if you believe that Chinese will the future lingua franca, I'd like to speak. Why do you think so? On the other hand, if you think no, English is continue to remain the dominant for the future global society, then why do you think so? We are going to have some discussion on this issue. So in this issue, so if you see some kind of a global turning point, I would say there is some turnaround moment in human history. So we are going to look into the past turnaround of 18th and 19th. That if you look at the past turnaround, we are going to look into what were the global turning points. Then looking into past global turning point will be insight for us to look into the future global turnaround. So that is that we are going to study the global turnaround so that we can answer to the question, the Chinese can really become the future global language. So this way we will continue. So on the one trail, we will continue with the bilingual trail, because maybe you should be interested in something to be bilingual. Actually, bilingual people can make a good translator. Then, what about the translator story? So we are moving on the translator story on the trail. So we talk about so what is the translators? So is there any? The last class we talked about what special skill the translator should have. So we're talking about the Douglas Robinson. He said that there are 3 special conditions that translate should meet. As you know, they must translate reliably and rapidly and cheaply. So in this regard, the Douglas Robinson was talking about 2 things. One is external knowledge. And he was talking about internal knowledge. So he explains this concept by saying the readers or client, they tend to see the translation from the external knowledge perspective. In other words, the clients and readers, they regard the translation as a finished product, as a final product, as a product. They take it as a commodity. It's like a carpenter. If you're a consumer to buy the furniture, you wouldn't care about how it was made. What you care is only the quality of the final product and design of the final product. The same is true with the translation. Your clients, they never mind how it was translated. They just see, they want it to be reliable and rapid and cheap. So this is the client's point of view, client's perspective to get the translation. Then how about this one? But however, the translators, they are looking at the translation from the perspective of internal knowledge. So it means the translators, when they start a translation, they always think about how to translate. In other words, he must decide the accuracy or the fidelity and to go closer to the fidelity and the text reliability, or should go closer to the fluency end of the scale. He must decide. And all depends the client's need and the scopus. And third is text type. It depends on text type. For example, this is a Harvard scale. So this is a free fluency end of the scale, and also this is the fidelity end of the scale. So it all depends on the textile type. What is textile type? It could be translating advertised line, or technical report, or business annual report, or movie subtitles, cartoon translation. It all depends on the text type. So this class and next class, we are going to look at how differently you can translate for the BA fluency. I would say BA fluency of translation, that means how we can translate so that in Korean's case, the Korean readers can find it so fluent, so they cannot imagine that actually this is a translation. It sounds so perfectly like Korean language, so they cannot believe this is a really translation. If your readers find that is the fluency and of the fluency, that's the result of the translator's choice to be fluent. Anyway, let's get back to this one. First of all, we talked about the translators there, then what is the special skill, and also we are talking about, then we put it on a history context. That's why we traced back into the world of Latin and the Greece and the Roman Empire, and now we are going to talk about the conquest in Latin America and America. Okay, this ends up the first module of our class, and we will continue with this historic story about Latin America in the second module. Okay, let's get back to our second module of week 5 class. This is a story about the histories in the Latin America and America. So you might be curious if you find that there is some different pattern in their history of a translator. So this source is Encyclopedia of Lutley's Dictionary of Translation. So imagine, so the Columbus, when he first arrived in the America, so how many languages were there? The linguistics, they guess that there are about 1,000 languages from 133 language families in America. So you can imagine the picture. A Spanish arrived, and all the people they met, they couldn't understand what they're talking. There was confusion was there. So the Columbus should find a way to how to communicate with them. So at that time, there was some Native Americans, so they wanted Native Americans to learn Spanish, but they didn't want to learn Spanish language. And at that time, so there was the Puritan ministers. Later, Puritan ministers arrived, but the Puritan ministers, they were using they are the language of native Indians when they spread the gospel to native Indians. So there was a problem. So what was his choice? He decided to bring 2 interpreters for him for his next expedition. So one interpreter was speaking Hebrew and Arabic. And it was interesting to find Columbus thought that if you can speak something like Hebrew and Arabic, maybe the native Indians can understand you. That means Columbus thought they couldn't understand what they were talking like Hebrew or they were talking like Arabic. So they brought 2 interpreters, but they couldn't understand. So what was his choice? So this was 2 interpreters, Rodrigo and Luis. So it didn't work. So what was his next choice? He captured 10 Native Americans and he brought them into Spain. And they taught and let them learn the Spanish language and let them learn the Spanish culture. And then he brought them back to America. So the captive, so they served as Columbus' tongue. So this is the pattern. So they took captive of Native Americans and they took them to their Spain and they let them learn the Spanish language. So this pattern is exactly the same pattern that America conquerors they used. How about Ojeda? Ojeda had the same problem. So he couldn't understand the language of this Mexican people, and so he found one of Native American girl her name was Isabel. So I don't know how the Isabel learned the Spanish, but anyway, she served as an interpreter of Ojeda. So Ojeda and Isabel was very important for Ojeda. They always come together, so whenever they communicate, and there was a romance between Ojeda and Isabel, and Isabel finally became his wife. And also, this is the same dilemma, the Cortes. The Cortes, when arrived in Mexico, he couldn't understand the language of Mexico. So he actually eventually conquered Mexico, but it was not only because of the military power, but because of another contributor, another helper. Who was it? It was a woman interpreter. Her name is Malinche. So at this time, there were so many languages in Mexico. The Corte uses 3 interpreters. So let's take an example. Is here. The Corte is using Aguila. So if Corte spoke in Spanish, then Aguila, another Spanish clergyman, churchman, he translated into Maya for Yucatec natives. Then there is another translator who, from this Maya language to the local dialect, she was Malinche. And there was still a 3rd interpreter, a Mexican boy, who was checking whether what the Cortes said is correctly translated in the local dialect. So there were 3 interpreters for Cortes when he was talking to the local people. So Malinche, so she is essential for Cortes to achieve his plan of conquest in Latin America. So historians say without Malinche, then the Cortes could have never achieved his dream of conquest in Mexico. Why? Because Malinche was born in a slave village and she was sold out as a slave. So she was one of 20 slave girls who were sold again to the Corte. And at that time, Aguila was the first interpreter. So he was out with Aguila. Then at some place that he was trying to communicate with another tribe, but Aguila couldn't understand what the tribe said. Then Malinche was with them. Then Malinche volunteered, I can understand. I can't interpret for you. Then she volunteered to interpret for Corte. That was the start how the Malinche started to work as an interpreter for the Corte. Actually, Malinche was, she's a Mexican, Malinche was interpreter, not only the interpreter, he was also advisor, and also she served as a secret agent between Mexico tribes and the Cortes. She helped a lot, so she tilted in favor of Cortes at the expense of her own people, Mexico people. So Malinche actually became the mother of Cortes' child. Anyway, so Malinchista in Mexico means someone who sells out or a betrayer, because Malinche was working for the benefit of working for the Cortes to achieve the dream of conquest. So, how about the America? In the America, more than 31 million inhabitants, they are speaking non-English. So there is the variety is a normal state of language. So this means that is forming a national identity, or such a American is such a multilingual society that helps to diversify American culture. So in the colonization, there was Puritan settlers as Somerset and Squanto. They are natively English. Somerset and Squanto was native American who could speak English when the Puritan first arrived in 1620. So we don't know how the Somerset and Squanto could learn English. Anyway, these two interpreters were essential for the Puritan colonies to survive in America. As you know, the Puritan people, when they were living in Britain, they were object of mockery. They was not the mainstream British people, and the British people thought the Puritan people as weird, very strange people. So that's why the Puritan people, they decided, why not? So we'd like to take courage and we'd like to take a voyage to come to the land of America. So let's start a new life. So they came there, but everything is so wild, it's so new. So though it was actually in several months that more than half of them actually had died. Then they met two helpers, they were interpreters. So Puritan leader Bradford, the Puritan minister, they found the Squanto. Squanto is very fluent. The Bradford said, sometimes I feel the Squanto seems to be more fluent than my English. So the Squanto taught American how to catch the fish and how to grow the corn. And Squanto also served as an interpreter for the peace negotiation with the Native Americans. So this way, that's what Native American interpreters like Squanto, they were very, very good helper. Of course, it's the early days of colonization. Then it began to change. Then the colonists, they could find that the British culture is superior to the Native Americans' culture, and they began to use the translation as a means of taking over the Indian culture. So it changes as the balance of power shifts in favor of European colonists. So translation was an instrument for Europeans to change Indian culture. They tried to affect Indian culture. So there is the word conversion went in hand with the conquest. So what does it mean? The conversion means the Christianity is that they thought Americans, they thought the native Indians, their culture was pagan. Pagan. Actually, the Old English, the British people, they used to be pagan. So pagan is something different to the Christianity. What is pagan? Pagan means they admire just the nature, the power of nature. And also they respect the power of warrior, mighty warrior. So they praise the courage and the military power. That is a pagan. So they just believe in the present word of courage and the power. They don't believe the Christianity believe. So the early European colonists, they thought the Native Americans, they tend to be pagan. In another word, their culture is inferior to European Christianity. So they thought that it's in their interest, we must change their faith. So we must remove the paganism in Native Americans, then let them believer of Christians. So let's make him Christian. So that means conversion, 개종. So in the history of America, North America and Latin America, it goes together. Conversion and conquest together. For example, in Latin America, it's always the old Catholic ministers, they arrive first. So they begin to talk, they begin to learn the native language. Then they begin to convert them into Christian. Then European military power, they arrives. Then the Spanish who came before the conqueror arrived, they served as the interpreter for the European conquerors like Cortes. So this is the second generation of interpreters in Latin America. The first generation is the captures. The Spanish, they took captive of the Native Americans and they brought this the first generation of interpreters in Latin America. Then, as time passes by, there was the old Catholic fathers who had arrived before the conquerors, European conquerors arrived. So they already knew the native language because before the conversion, then they served as interpreter for the European conquerors. So that's why they call the conversion and the conquest come together. In another word, the conversion of Christianity laid the foundation for the European conquerors to conquer the Latin America. So, well, getting back to American history of translators, there was a time of building national culture. So that was in the 19th century, they began to have a mass audience for translation during the 19th century. So at that time, the American taste was the melodrama and the romance. That was the first time in America, in the USA, to have the mass readership for literary work. And their taste was only romance, a love story and melodrama. So William Dunlap, a New York playwright and theater manager, he successfully staged a translation for sentimental drama of German August von Gosebuch. There is another man, the Henry William Herbert. He is an English immigrant who published fiction, history, and the writing also translated sensational French novels. As you can see, that sensational French novel was very appealing. It would find the favor among the American readers in the 19th century. Then there was a turnaround moment that started with a poet, great poet of Ezra Pound. So American translation entered a period of innovation, and the turning point was translation of poetry, Ezra Pound. When you read the translation, then they found, wow, this is not romance story. It's not only the romance and the sensational story, this is American poetry. So American poetry began to influence the global readership. So American translator began to see translation autonomous literary work. So what does it mean? They thought, American translation itself is literary work. Its translation work itself is independent from the original text. So you can imagine this is the translation. This is the choice of translators to go closer to fluency end. In other words, they want the translation to be imaginative and creative and original enough. So the translation should be so faithful to the original text. So this is interesting thing. What about American publishing industry? The book production has increased forward since 1940s. However, how much is the share of translation? Is only 2 or 4% of annual total. And also it's talking about directionality. Is it AP translation? In this case, AP translation means from English to foreign language. In this case, so directionality, AP or BA translation for books. The American, American publisher, they were selling translation rights for more and more foreign English language books. But they are not trying to translate from foreign book into English, but spends less on the rights to publish English language translation of foreign books. So it means that American publishers, they are trying to sell English books to the global society, the foreign readers. Instead, they are not so much interested in importing the foreign books and translate into English book so that American readers can read the Korean book or Spanish book or Indian book. So this means that America, not only the economic dominance, but also the American is trying to maintain its cultural leadership. He is always trying, Americans tend to be more interested in exporting their books, their literary works, without being fully interested in importing the foreign books. So this is about directionality of AP or BA translation. And this brings us another question, how about Korea and how about your country? So AB translation of Korean books is actively going on, or BA translation is more actively going on. This is the question that you can have when we're talking about the American history of translation in the publishing industry. Okay, this wraps up the module 2 of week 5 class.